Well, howdy everybody! In this video, I'm going to be showing you how I made this quick and easy brush roll, which is another great stash busting gift idea. I started this project by going through my stash and picking out two fat quarters that I thought would look cute together. So I have this jellyfish one and this octopus one, and the first thing I did was iron those. Now, two fat quarters wound up being pretty much the perfect amount of fabric for this project. Next, I needed to do a little bit of measuring, so I gathered up a bunch of things that could be stored in a roll like this. Some things like some colored pencils, various office supplies, and in my case, makeup brushes. The first thing I did was measure the width of my fat quarters to figure out the biggest I could make my roll, and then I kind of reverse engineered everything from there. Next, I measured my tallest makeup brushes to figure out how tall the roll needed to be. Since my tallest brush is 8 inches long, I decided 10 inches would be a good height. I also measured my shorter brushes to make sure the inner pocket wouldn't be too tall, making sure I could still easily see and grab the shorter brushes. Next, I had to do a little bit of experimenting. Now, when you're putting a round 3D object into a flat 2D shape, you need to cut the shape to be a little bit bigger than you think you do. Because if you just measure the diameter of your makeup brush or pencil or whatever you're putting in there, you also have to remember that as much as wide as that object is, it also is that tall. So you need a little bit of extra room to be able to accommodate for that. So I cut myself 2 pieces of scrap fabric and marked lines at different distances to make different size channels to measure my brushes with. I made 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch, 1 inch, and 1 1/4 inch channels, which I made sure that I went back and labeled. Next, I tested a few brushes, pens, colored pencils, and regular pencils in the channels. I found that most of my colored pencils and office supplies fit well in the 3/4 inch channels, but makeup brushes tended to be a little bit more varied. So if you're in the mood to make this for maybe the artist in your life, I'd go with all 3/4 inch channels.
Hey, you wanna come help me? Thank you. Oh, no? What? Oh, Lils, I need that fabric. I just ironed that. Although I did put it in your spot, so that is kind of my fault. No, you can come back. There you go. There you go.
After that quick inspection from my supervisor to make sure everything's up to code, I went through my makeup brushes and picked out my most used essential ones. I measured them in the sample channels and tallied up how many of each size I would need. After doing a little bit of math and adding on some empty space to help the roll up smoother, I came up with this quick set of dimensions. I made a little mistake here, hold on a second. Now, I accidentally mismarked and mismeasured a bunch of times in this marking process, but most of it was before I cut things out, so just remember to double check all your work and measure twice, cut once, all that good stuff. So I cut a rectangle out of the outer fabric to be 17.5 inches wide by 11 inches tall. Now my notes said 10, but I forgot to add 1/2 inch seam allowance to that. And I cut a piece of the lining fabric to the same size. Or it should have been. It was 1 inch too short on top because I forgot about that seam allowance in the minute between cutting out both of the pieces, but it wound up not being that big of a deal. And I cut a rectangle for the pocket out of the lining fabric, measuring 17.5 inches wide by 5.5 inches tall. To start, I folded the top edge of the pocket down by 1/2 inch, then I folded that over by 1/2 inch again to make a nice, clean rolled hem. Then oh, how embarrassing. I guess I forgot to clean up my last project. These DIY tea envelope, later learned that they are called tea wallets, which you can find a video about in this card above that I am pointing to. Anyway, then I pressed and sewed down that hem, sewing very close to the lower edge. I went a little faster than I should have, and I accidentally sewed off the side of it a little bit, but you know what, it's okay. We're gonna pretend that I did this perfectly. Yep, look at that amazing, clean hem that just, it's the best hem in the whole world. I'm an expert. Next, lining up the bottom edges, I pinned the pocket to the lining, both right sides facing me, and I basted along the sides and the bottom using a wide stitch length and a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now, if you wanted to baste the top shut, you probably could. I chose not to, mostly because I am lazy. I'm really not sure why I keep leaving in all of this extra footage of sewing, because I assume if you're watching this video, you know what sewing looks like. Next, I measured where the channels would be. I wanted the largest brushes to be on the left side so they would be the first to roll up, since in my experience, it's easier to curve small things around one big thing than to try to curve one big thing around many small things. I wanted to have 1 inch of empty space before the first brush started to help the rolling process. I wound up sewing 1 1.5 inch channel, 1 1.25 inch channel, 8 3/4 inch channels, and 3 1/2 inch channels. This also leaves 5 inches of space at the end to be rolled over and help it lay smoothly. I also mismeasured this part, but I figured it out before I sewed it, so I just had to go back and remeasure. I forgot that I needed to account for a 1/2 inch seam allowance on either side, so I just measured 1 inch to start instead of 1.5 inches. So at the end of it, at the end of everything after I went back and remarked it, I wound up being off by 1/4 inch, which I'm not quite sure where I messed up that time, but you know what, if it's only 1/4 inch, I'll take it. Now ideally when you're making markings like this, you would be using something like a water-soluble marking pencil or one of those heat erasable things, but nah, I live life on the edge. At least I used a different one from the original to the corrected markings. Next starts the very long process of sewing the channels. I started on the right side, but you could probably start on the left if you wanted to. I lined up my needle with the line that I marked, then started sewing about a 1/2 inch down from the top of the pocket. I backstitched until I was just off the top of the pocket, then I resumed a regular stitch all the way down and off the bottom of the lining. So in this project, there's a lot of stitching, but it's all straight stitching, so it's really not that complicated, and that makes this a decent project for beginners, as long as you measure correctly. Once that was done, I decided to stitch shut the spaces that I intentionally left empty. I sewed along the seam line that I made when I stitched that hem on the top of the pocket. Next, it was time to attach the outside fabric to the lining. Right sides together, and you can see where I'm about to figure out that I cut something out wrong, and you can see me spending a little bit of energy trying to figure out how I wound up with one side much shorter than the other. But it's okay, it really didn't work out too horribly. So I started pinning all the way around, and this time I decided to leave the opening on the side instead of on the bottom, you know, for variety. Filming Sam, Editing Sam, and Audio Sam are 3 different Sams. Video Sam films everything, Editing Sam leaves everything in there, and then Audio Sam is just real snarky about the whole thing. Anyway, as I got closer to pinning the top, I thought for a second, you know, I can make this better. And inspired by my last project, I decided to add a flap. This way, it could help prevent things from slipping out during travel, and it could also help to protect anything around the roll from potentially getting makeup on it. And I had just enough of my main fabric left to be able to do it. So I sat down again at my super high-tech, ultra state-of-the-art cutting table, and I measured out the tallest flap I could possibly get. So I knew I wanted it to be 1 layer, so it would be really floppy and easy to roll. I cut mine to be 5 inches tall by 17.5 inches wide. So in retrospect, I would recommend only putting a flap long enough to cover just the brushes in the channels, but this still turned out pretty well. Again, why'd I leave in footage of cutting? If you passed kindergarten, I assume you know how scissors work. Just enjoy the pretty background music. Once cut, I measured out and marked a 1/2 inch from the sides and bottom in order to make a 1/4 inch rolled hem. Now, when you're doing a rolled hem this tiny, I would highly recommend finger pressing everything first before ironing it, just to make the ironing process a little easier. And that just means using the pressure and heat from your hands to quickly fold everything and do a quick press before you follow it up with the iron. Quilting cottons take this very, very well. So once you do the entire length of the bottom, unroll the outer inch or so to be able to do the sides. Now, don't worry about accidentally undoing that bottom hem when you get to pressing the sides. We need to make the score marks all the way in the corners so that we'll have a better time finishing the corners off nice and neatly. So you see here I unrolled a little bit of that bottom hem, but it's okay. Also, quilting cotton is very forgiving and shows a lot of lines. You're gonna have to really get in there if you want to iron out every single wrinkle and every single crease in quilting cotton. Both a blessing and a curse. So I always just kind of thought this was how you do mitered corners. I think I saw it in like a Pinterest pictorial at one point. But I learned this is way more finicky and complicated than other methods, which I looked up to make sure I was using the term mitered corners correctly, which I guess I'm not, but I put a lot of effort into filming this, so I'm leaving it in. So first you're going to unfold the corners and make the first fold from the outer corner to the 1/2 inch corner mark and finger press. Then you're going to fold that up again as if you were doing a rolled hem, but just on the corner. Next, all you have to do is just reassemble those rolled edges on the sides. This is where having a cork mat under your work surface is useful, because you can just stick pins through things directly into the table. Also, I promise this is much easier when you're able to get your face right in and look at what you're doing, and you don't have to kind of stay out of your own way to get everything in view of the camera. Also, I imagine having shorter nails does help. Honestly, I would just recommend going and looking up another tutorial on how to do actual mitered corners, because I imagine that would be a lot easier than whatever I'm doing here. Now, once you have your corner situation figured out, sew along this new hemline, being sure that you're catching the folds of each corner piece in your stitching. So you might have to dig out a magnifying glass if you need it, hand turn your needle just to make sure you are getting the exact number of stitches you want. Also, if you turn your stitch length down and do smaller stitches, you are going to have more stitches, which means you're gonna have more opportunities to make sure that you're catching every place that you need to in a stitch. Why did I leave this in real time? I could have sworn I sped this clip up. I keep telling myself I'm going to do much better with all the editing and making sure that I'm not putting in unnecessary stuff that you don't really need to see, but clearly I have not learned my lesson. At least I learned to put a nice, to write a script this time. I'm reading from a script for the most part. If it takes me an average of like 4 or 5 videos to learn to do something useful, then, I don't know, see you next year with my better editing skills. Alright, now we can go back to putting everything together. If you wanted to skip the flap entirely, you totally can. So place the flap right side of the flap facing the right side of the outer fabric, aligned with the top of your lining fabric. Pin into place and sew all the way around with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now make sure that you're not catching that finished edge of the flap in with the stitching on the sides. And in order to do that, if you are doing this big flap all the way across, I'd recommend a bigger seam allowance on that rolled hem. Pulling it in only a 1/2 inch on each side left me with not a whole lot of wiggle room. And here I am, pinning my thing. Once that's done, I clipped all my corners so they would be nice and sharp, And then I turned everything right side out very carefully. I do still have some pins in there. And then I neatly arranged everything. I poked all my corners, I kind of ran a pencil up along my side seams, and I neatly arranged everything for a good press in order to make some really nice crisp edges. And I first pressed this with the flap up and kind of pulling out away from that seam, and then I pressed it again, folding the flap down, and I feel like that helped me get a really nice sharp press on that top area. Next, I pinned the corners of the flap out of the way, then I sewed a very narrow edge all along the outside perimeter, both to seal up the hole that I left, and also to help the flap stay turned downwards. Now with that stitching done, we are almost done. We're actually functionally done, but we could use a closure. Now, rolling up an empty brush roll is going to yield a little bit of a different size than a full brush roll, so I loaded up my roll with the brushes I plan on putting in it. Then I rolled it up to get an accurate measurement of how long I needed the ribbon to be, as well as to find a good place to attach it to the roll. I marked a small rectangle opposite the edge of the rolled up roll and decided that was where I would sew on the ribbon. It's about halfway down. And I used a pen because it was easier to see than pencil. Now, I took some ribbon, unrolled a little bit, and I measured out about 12 inches of ribbon above the roll on either side. So I cut it, then I used a lighter to melt the edges so they won't fray. It's an old trick I learned back in my ballerina days. We used to burn our point shoe ribbons. It's also why you have a bunch of 12-year-old girls asking for lighters. Anyway, so I cinched the edges so that they wouldn't melt, then I emptied my brush roll again, and then I sewed on the ribbon where I previously marked in a little rectangle. It doesn't have to be rectangle, it could be an X or a couple of straight lines. It's just, again, in my days from being a failed ballerina, I learned that rectangles are really good and sturdy shapes to sew ribbons on. Because, believe it or not, ballet dancers have to sew our own ribbons on our own point shoes. They don't come like that. We gotta do it ourselves. And that's that. It's finally done. Ready to be stocked with brushes, rolled up, and taken on the go. Or, pencils or pens or colored pencils or, what have you. But these are my kind of essential makeup brushes that I use more often and I like to travel with and take on the go with me. And look at that, you can turn it upside down and shake it out and nothing falls out. Thanks, Flap!
Y'all, Manic Panic Hot Hot Pink did not come to play. So that was this video about how I made this little brush roll that could also be used as a pencil roll, school supply roll, pretty much anything tall and skinny that you would want to put in a convenient little pouch that you can roll up and take with you wherever you want to go. Again, not that anyone is going anywhere in the immediate future. So this whole thing was super easy, it went together super quickly, and it went together surprisingly better than expected, even though I mismeasured a couple of times, more than once. My brain just completely checked out. My brain is off on vacation somewhere because real Sam can't be. If I were to make this again, the only real change that I would make would be to have this little flat part only cover the section that has the sewn channels that your actual brushes or pens or whatever would go into, and not have it span the entire length of the roll, because then you get this little thing happening, which isn't the end of the world, it's not a big deal, but just a little minor tweak that I would make if I were to make this again. Thank you for joining me on this second installment of DIY stash busting gifts that you can give to people that they would actually use and maybe actually want. All in all, I used 2 fat quarters of fabric to be able to make this roll. And again, this is very customizable. You can make it to exactly the needs of either yourself or the person that you are making this for, just by changing the sizes of the little channels. There is a little bit of math involved, but it's really not that bad. It's like algebra, it's addition and multiplication, and it's kind of like algebra level stuff. It's not like it's, integral calculus or anything. Also, something new and very exciting is I started up a little Redbubble account. So I have a little shop that has a bunch of little designs in it. Some of them are meant for face masks, some of them are meant for kind of stickers, some of them can be put on anything. The ones that I am most proud of are my little stick figure ballet variation diagrams. I've been doodling those since middle school. So now I'm happy to be able to actually put those out on a platform that people can actually see them, and if they like them, buy them. I'm using my Redbubble as kind of a testing launch pad for potential designs that I might work with companies to try to turn into pins or patches. I know I am not nearly a big enough YouTuber to kind of justify putting my own merch with like my own sayings and my own things on there, but I do think that I come up with a couple of really good signs that are universal throughout everybody who sews. So feel free to go ahead and check that out. Also, feel free to give me a follow over at Thread and Needlefish over on Instagram. That's where I post all kinds of things. I post behind the scenes stuff, I post updates, I post things that don't make it to YouTube, and also occasionally more cat antics. But yeah, thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, or you were at least entertained by the past, 20-ish minutes? But if you liked it, go ahead, give me a like, give me a comment down below. You can subscribe to my channel if you want to see more sewing stuff. I sometimes do DIY stuff like this, and I also had my Cyber Week deal thing order from Mood Fabrics just came in, so I will have some clothing sew-along videos coming up in the next couple of weeks. But yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye! Why is this ring on this finger? This ring goes on this finger. As proof, my brain is in Tahiti right now. No, my brain was in Tahiti last time. My brain's in like Bora Bora or somewhere.